Seraphine had learned, a long time ago, that the world speaks in sounds most people never bother to hear. The drip of a candle before it dies, the way a floorboard groans differently under a heavy man than under a light one, the particular silence that settles in a room when someone in it is hiding something. She had learned all of this not by choice, but by necessity, because at the age of 12, a fever had taken her sight, and the world had gone dark and never come back. She did not spend her years feeling sorry about it. There was no time for that. There was work to do. For 3 years, Seraphine had served in Velthorn Keep as a wine attendant. She knew every corridor by heart. She knew the 42 steps from the kitchen door to the entrance of the Great Hall. She knew the 19 steps from the hall entrance to the long table where the Alpha King sat. She knew the sound of the King's council members, Lord Edric, who shuffled his left foot, Lady Morvain, who tapped her ring against her goblet when she was bored, the head steward, Casson, who breathed loudly through his nose. She knew all of them. She knew none of them noticed her. That was fine. She had learned to be invisible the same way she had learned everything else. Quietly, carefully, and without complaint. The night of the feast was not supposed to be anything unusual. King Kaelis Dravenmore was hosting a diplomatic dinner for Lord Magistrate Edrin, a man who had traveled 3 days from the eastern border under a banner of peace. The throne room had been dressed for the occasion. Long tables covered in white linen, candles in gold holders, the smell of roasted meat and warm bread filling the air. 47 guests were seated. Seraphine knew, because she had counted the chairs that afternoon when the hall was being arranged. She moved along the left corridor as she always did, her right hand resting lightly on the edge of the nearest table to keep her bearings, the wine pitcher held steady in her left. She poured slowly, carefully, never spilling. The guests talked around her as though she were furniture. She did not mind. She was listening to something far more interesting than their conversation. The feast had been going on for about an hour when she first noticed it. She had just refilled a goblet near the eastern wall and was turning back toward the kitchen corridor when she heard it. A breath, just one breath, held a half-second too long, from somewhere behind the large tapestry that hung along the eastern wall. The tapestry was old, heavy, floor to ceiling, depicting some great battle from the kingdom's history. It was the kind of tapestry that billowed slightly when someone walked past it. It was also wide enough for a person to stand behind. Seraphine stopped walking. She tilted her head slightly to the left, the way she always did when she was listening hard. Around her, the feast continued. Laughter, clinking cups, the king saying something that made his council smile. Nobody noticed that the wine attendant had gone still. She waited. There it was again. A breath. Controlled, shallow, slow. The breath of someone who was trying very hard not to make a sound. She had heard people hide before. Servants playing games in the corridors. Children sneaking sweets from the kitchen. And their breathing was different. Nervous, excited, quick. This breath was none of those things. This breath was calm in the specific, practiced way that only trained people could manage. Her stomach went cold. She began counting, the way she always did when she needed to think clearly. 1, 2, 3. She placed herself in the room. She was standing at the eastern wall. The tapestry was 3 steps to her right. The king's chair was, she retraced her steps in her mind, 8 steps to her right, and slightly forward, at the head of the long table. The nearest guard she had heard moving was stationed at the far door, at least 12 steps behind her and to the left. 3 steps from the tapestry to her, 8 steps from her to the king, 12 steps to the nearest guard. She thought about calling out. She thought about it for exactly 2 seconds, and then she dismissed it. She was an Omega. She was a servant. She was blind. If she called out in the middle of a royal feast and pointed at a tapestry and said she heard something behind it, the most likely result was that she would be removed from the hall, firmly and without apology, while the feast continued, and whatever was behind that tapestry continued with it. She needed another way. She turned herself quietly and began walking, not toward the kitchen, not toward the guard, but along the edge of the table, toward the king. She kept her pace steady. She did not rush. A servant who moved too fast drew eyes, and she did not want eyes on her right now. She wanted eyes exactly where they already were, on the food, on the wine, on the diplomatic conversation at the head of the table. She counted her steps. 4, 5, 6. She was close now. She could hear the king, his voice low and even, talking to the magistrate about trade routes. 7, 8. She stopped beside his chair. She set the wine pitcher down on the table with a deliberate sound, not a crash, but a firm, clear clink that was just loud enough to interrupt without alarming. The king paused mid-sentence. She felt his attention shift to her. She leaned forward slightly and spoke close to his ear, her voice barely above a breath. "Your Majesty, please do not turn around. Please do not stand. There is someone behind the Eastern Tapestry. They have been there for at least 4 minutes, and they are trying very hard not to be heard." She straightened up and took one step back, as though she had simply come to refill his cup. For a moment, nothing happened. The table continued around them. The magistrate said something. The king responded, his voice completely unchanged. Smooth, calm, the voice of a man who had spent his life making sure his face and his voice never gave anything away. But beneath the table, Seraphine heard a small, precise sound. A faint click, something pressed, something mechanical, something she had never heard before and suspected she was not supposed to know about. 5 seconds passed. Then she heard the doors. Not the main doors, the inner doors, the ones set into the wall on either side of the throne dais, the ones that looked like panels in the wood, and that most guests never noticed. They opened fast and without sound, and from them came footsteps. 6 sets of them, heavy and deliberate, moving in trained coordination across the stone floor. Everything happened very quickly after that. The tapestry was seized and pulled back in one movement. Behind it, crouched low against the cold stone wall, was a man dressed in servant's livery, the same plain dark clothing that Seraphine herself wore. He was holding a thin-bladed knife in his right hand. He was positioned at an angle that pointed him directly toward the king's back, the exact spot where the king's back would be when he rose from his chair to make the traditional end-of-feast address. He had calculated it. He had prepared. He had dressed like them, moved like them, blended in with the 30-odd servants that moved through the keep on a night like this. He had gotten past the gate checks, the inner checks, the steward's review. He had found his position, and he had waited, patient and professional. He had not counted on a blind woman with ears like a hawk. The guards took him in under 10 seconds. He did not fight. Whatever plan he had, it ended the moment those inner doors opened, and he seemed to understand immediately that it was over. The knife was taken, his hands were secured, and he was removed from the hall through a side passage before most of the guests had fully understood what had just occurred. The hall took a moment to find itself. Then it was loud, very loud. People rising, asking questions, voices crossing over each other in alarm. The magistrate was pale. The council members were on their feet. The guards at the main doors had moved inward. There was that particular chaos that comes when something terrible nearly happened, and people are still catching up to the fact that it didn't. Through all of it, Seraphine stood where she was. She had not moved since she stepped back from the king's chair. She held the wine pitcher in both hands and waited, the way she always waited, quietly, without drawing attention, letting the world move around her. Then she heard his chair move, the king standing up, then his footsteps, and they were coming toward her. "You," said King Kalis Dravenmore. His voice was not loud, but it cut clean through the noise of the room. "You told me." "Yes, Your Majesty." "How did you know?" Seraphine considered the question for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to give him the true one rather than the simple one. "He was not breathing like someone who belonged there," she said. "People who belong somewhere breathe like they belong. Their breathing is easy. It follows the rhythm of what they're doing. Walking, working, resting. He was breathing like someone who was holding themselves still on purpose. Like someone who was counting down to something." The king was quiet for a moment. "You heard that," he said. "It was not quite a question. I hear most things, Your Majesty. The investigation that followed took 11 days. The assassin, whose name turned out to be Drovek, a hired professional with a history in 2 other kingdoms, confessed within 3 days. He had been brought into the keep as part of the magistrate's supply convoy, hidden among the additional staff that traveled with a diplomatic party. The magistrate himself was not directly involved, but 2 members of his entourage were, and they had paid Drovek a significant sum to ensure that the Alpha King did not survive the feast. The plot had been months in the making. It had been carefully organized. The people behind it had thought of nearly everything. They had not thought of Seraphine, the head of palace security, a tall, broad alpha named Commander Holt, who had served the king for 14 years, reviewed the evening's events in detail. He interviewed every guard on duty. He reviewed the gate logs and the steward's service registry. He walked the hall 3 times, standing in the spot where Seraphine had been standing when she first heard the breath behind the tapestry. On the 3rd walk, he stood in that spot for a long time without saying anything. Then he went to the king and told him that by every standard measure of palace security, the threat should not have been detectable from that position. The tapestry was solid. The alcove behind it was partially sound-absorbing, due to the stone construction. Even trained security personnel would have had to be very close and very alert to catch what Seraphine had caught from 8 steps away, with a feast full of noise happening around her. The king listened to all of this carefully. Then he asked for Seraphine to be brought to him. She came to the meeting the way she came to everything, without rushing, without nervousness, her steps quiet, and even on the stone floor, her hands relaxed at her sides. She had been a servant here for 3 years, and she knew this corridor well. 26 steps from the east staircase, left turn, 9 more steps. The door would be directly in front of her. She knocked. She was told to enter. There were 3 people in the room. She could tell from the breathing and the weight of the silence. The king, Commander Holt, and someone else she didn't recognize, whose breathing was quick and light, and suggested someone trying to appear calmer than they were. Seraphine, the king said, "Sit down." She found the chair. It was where chairs in this room always were, and sat. "I want to ask you something," the king said, "and I want you to answer honestly, not politely." "Yes, Your Majesty." "Have you ever noticed other things, in the keep, in the halls, things that seemed wrong to you, that you didn't report because you didn't think anyone would listen?" Seraphine was quiet for a moment. She thought about the honest answer, and she decided to give it. "A few times, yes," she said. "Small things, mostly. A door that was opened and closed in a pattern that didn't match the cleaning schedule. A voice in the lower west corridor, at a time when no one should have been there. I did not report them because I couldn't point to them on a map, or put a face to them, and I was aware that without those things, my word on its own would not carry much." There was a silence. Then Commander Holt said, very quietly, "That is a fair assessment of how things have worked here." "Yes," the king said, "it is, and it is going to change." 3 weeks later, Seraphine was formally appointed as an advisor to the palace's Inner Security Council. The announcement was brief and practical. A new position had been created. A new perspective was being added to the council's work, effective immediately. There was no ceremony. There was no celebration in the throne room. There was simply a chair added to the table in the council chamber. And on the morning of the first meeting she attended, Commander Holt, who had spent 14 years in that room, pulled the chair out for her before she found it herself. She sat down. She listened to the full briefing. She asked 2 questions, both of which led to the discovery of a minor but significant gap in the overnight watch rotation. The gap was corrected by the end of the day. After the meeting, one of the younger council members, a nobleman's son who had been on the security detail for less than a year, approached her in the corridor. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes. Are you not afraid? Being in that room, with all of them, after everything?" Seraphine considered this for a moment. Then she said, "I was a blind Omega servant in a palace full of people who never looked at me. I have been invisible my whole life. The only thing that has changed is that now, at least, I have a chair." She walked away before he could respond. She knew the corridor well. 40 steps to the east staircase, then down. She counted them as she went, the way she always had, the way she always would. The eastern tapestry, she had been told, had been taken down the morning after the feast. The king had ordered it removed, and the wall left bare. When she had heard about it, she had nodded to herself, unsurprised. She had known it was coming. She had been 3 rooms away, through a closed door, when the king gave the order to the chamberlain. Some people needed to see something to believe it was real. Seraphine had never had that luxury, and because of that, She had always understood the world more clearly than most.